The storm clouds gathered over Willow's Edge like an unspoken secret, heavy and foreboding. The air crackled with tension as if the town itself held its breath, waiting for something, or someone, to tip the delicate balance. Nestled along the jagged coastline, the town had an allure that made it hard to leave and even harder to forget. But for those who stayed, it had a way of exposing their deepest scars. Ellie Carter hadn't come back to Willow's Edge out of love for its postcard-perfect streets. It was necessity, a last-ditch effort to escape the crushing emptiness that had crept into her life. Her career as a documentary photographer had reached new heights, her images celebrated for their raw intimacy. But somewhere between the flashing lights of gallery openings and the lonely hotel rooms, Ellie had lost herself. Willow's Edge was supposed to be a temporary refuge. She didn't expect it to dig its claws into her. Then there was Miles Harrington, a man of few words and many regrets. Once a celebrated architect in the city, his life had unraveled when his wife of 10 years left him in a blaze of accusations and public scandal. Seeking solace, Miles had retreated to Willow's Edge, where he threw himself into the restoration of its lighthouse. The structure was a relic of the town's past, beaten by storms but never surrendering. It mirrored the battle he fought within himself. Their collision course began at the town's Autumn Festival, an annual tradition that brought together neighbors, visitors, and estranged souls like Ellie and Miles. Ellie had been hired to document the festival, though she approached the task with the detached professionalism of someone just passing through. Balancing precariously on a ladder near the fairground's edge, she was focused on capturing the perfect shot when a stray elbow jolted her. "Watch it," she snapped, clutching her camera as she teetered. Strong hands steadied the ladder, and Ellie found herself glaring into the face of a stranger. "Maybe don't set up in the middle of the main walkway," the man countered, his voice steady but laced with irritation. Ellie's eyes narrowed. "And maybe don't walk around like you own the place." Miles raised an eyebrow, his lips curving into the faintest smirk. "Fair point. It wasn't a meet-cute. It was friction, charged with an energy neither of them could place, but both felt." Ellie brushed herself off, determined to forget the encounter, but she couldn't shake the image of his dark eyes, or the way his voice lingered like the scent of rain on dry pavement. The next day, Ellie found herself face-to-face with Miles again, this time under far less coincidental circumstances. The town council, desperate to preserve its history, had assigned her to document the restoration of the town's bridge, a project Miles was leading. The bridge was a landmark that had weathered decades of wear and tear, and it was Ellie's job to capture its transformation. "You again," she said flatly when she saw him standing by the bridge's railing, a clipboard in hand. Miles gave a half-smile, one that barely reached his eyes. "Small town." Ellie folded her arms. "I hope you're better at restoring bridges than keeping people from falling off ladders." He didn't laugh, but something softened in his expression. "Guess we'll find out." The dynamic between them was tense, almost adversarial, but it was impossible to ignore the pull beneath the surface. As they began working together, their opposing natures clashed. Ellie's eye for imperfection often led her to challenge Miles' precise, methodical approach to the project. Miles, in turn, found her impulsiveness maddening but intriguing. It wasn't long before their shared project began revealing cracks in their facades. One afternoon, as Ellie reviewed her photographs of the bridge's progress, Miles approached her with a blueprint in hand. "Look," he said, pointing to a section of the design. "This part needs to be reinforced before we move forward." Ellie studied the blueprint, then glanced up at him. "You don't take risks, do you?" "Not when lives depend on it," he replied. "Why? Do you?" "Every time I pick up my camera," she said. "It's how you find the truth." Miles tilted his head, studying her for a moment. "And what truth are you hoping to find here?" Ellie hesitated. She wasn't ready to admit that the bridge, and maybe Miles himself, was starting to feel like more than just another assignment. But something in her silence must have answered his question, because Miles didn't press her further. Instead, he simply nodded and walked away, leaving her with thoughts she couldn't shake. The inciting moment came a week later, during a town meeting about the bridge. A storm was on the horizon, and tensions were high as the council debated whether the restoration could be completed in time. Miles argued passionately for the project, his voice calm but firm. "We don't have the luxury of waiting," he said. "This bridge connects the heart of the town. Without it, we lose more than just a piece of history. We lose what ties us together." Ellie listened, her chest tightening. She realized that the bridge wasn't just a metaphor for Miles. It was also a reflection of her own fractured life. She had spent so long capturing other people's stories that she had forgotten how to build her own. When the council approved an accelerated timeline, Miles turned to Ellie with a look that was equal parts challenge and invitation. "Ready to prove me wrong about photographers?" he asked. Ellie smirked, masking the way her pulse quickened. "Only if you're ready to prove architects can build more than just walls." The stage was set, and the tension between them was undeniable. As the storm loomed closer, the lines between duty and desire began to blur. Neither Ellie nor Miles could ignore the growing connection between them, or the risk it posed to their carefully guarded hearts. The bridge project became a rhythm that beat through the heart of Willow's Edge, pulling Ellie and Miles together in a reluctant partnership. Each day began with the sun rising over the worn wooden planks, its golden rays spilling over the scaffolding that lined the structure. Workers moved like clockwork, their hammers echoing across the quiet waters below. For Ellie and Miles, however, the work was far more than labor. It became an arena where their personalities collided and intertwined. Early stages of connection. Ellie was the first to break the routine. She arrived at the site one morning armed not with her usual camera gear, but with 2 steaming cups of coffee. Miles was reviewing the day's plans, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Peace offering," Ellie said, setting a cup beside him. Miles glanced at her, one eyebrow raised. "What's the catch?" "No catch. Just figured you could use a caffeine boost. And maybe a little less glaring first thing in the morning." He took the cup without a word, but a faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. It was the smallest of gestures, but it marked the beginning of something neither of them could define. Their conversations began to flow more naturally. Between coordinating workers and documenting the bridge's progress, they traded quips and shared snippets of their lives. Miles learned about Ellie's nomadic years as a photographer, how she chased stories across continents, capturing protests, weddings, and moments of quiet humanity. Ellie, in turn, discovered that Miles' meticulous nature stemmed from his architectural background. He once designed skyscrapers, buildings that defined city skylines, but he spoke of them with detachment, as though they belonged to someone else. "I walked away from all of it," he admitted one afternoon, leaning against the bridge's railing. "The awards, the recognition, it didn't mean anything when my marriage fell apart." Ellie hesitated before asking, "What happened?" Miles stared out at the water, his jaw tightening. "I poured everything into my work, thinking it was enough. Turns out, you can't build a life the same way you build a building." The honesty in his voice caught Ellie off guard. She saw the cracks in his carefully constructed exterior and felt a pang of recognition. She, too, had built walls around herself, though hers were made of motion, always running, never staying in one place long enough to be vulnerable. "You're not the only one who's good at running," she said quietly. "I've spent so long hiding behind my camera, I don't even know what it's like to be part of the picture anymore." Their eyes met, and for a moment, the air between them felt charged with something unspoken. But before either could say anything, one of the workers called for Miles, breaking the spell. Supporting characters and interactions. The growing connection between Ellie and Miles didn't go unnoticed. Lily, Ellie's best friend since childhood, was the first to comment. "So, the brooding architect," she said one evening over drinks at the local tavern. "What's the deal?" Ellie rolled her eyes. "There's no deal. He's just complicated. Complicated is code for I like him, but I'm scared to admit it," Lily teased. "Come on, Ellie. It's been years since you let anyone in. Maybe it's time." Meanwhile, Miles faced scrutiny from his older brother, Daniel, who visited the site one weekend. A successful lawyer, Daniel had always been the practical one in their family. "This thing with Ellie," Daniel said as they stood near the lighthouse, watching the waves crash against the rocks. "Is it serious?" Or are you just setting yourself up to get hurt again? Miles shook his head. It's not like that. Not yet, Daniel replied. Just be careful. You've worked hard to rebuild your life. Don't let it fall apart again. Despite the external pressures, Ellie and Miles found solace in their time together. They began to share small rituals, like meeting at the lighthouse after work to watch the sunset. The conversations during these moments ranged from lighthearted banter to deeply personal confessions. One evening, Ellie brought her camera and handed it to Miles. Here, she said, take a picture. Miles frowned. I don't know how. Just point and shoot. It's not rocket science. Reluctantly, Miles lifted the camera and snapped a photo of Ellie, her silhouette framed by the golden light of the setting sun. When he looked at the image, something shifted inside him. For the first time, he saw Ellie not as the guarded photographer, but as someone vulnerable, someone real. You're good at hiding, he said softly, handing the camera back. Ellie smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. Takes one to know one. Challenges arise. As the project progressed, cracks began to form, not in the bridge, but in their tentative bond. Ellie's insecurities, fueled by her past, started to surface. She found herself pulling back whenever she felt too close to Miles, afraid of being hurt again. Miles, in turn, struggled with his own doubts. He questioned whether he was capable of building something lasting, whether with Ellie or the bridge itself. The weight of his past failure loomed over him, threatening to derail the progress he'd made. Their tensions came to a head one rainy afternoon. A miscommunication about the project led to a heated argument. You don't trust me, do you? Ellie snapped, her voice rising above the sound of the rain. You're so obsessed with control, you can't handle the idea of someone else having a say. Miles glared at her, his jaw tight. And you can't handle letting anyone in. You hide behind your camera because it's easier than facing the real world. The words stung, and for a moment, they stood in silence, the rain soaking through their clothes. Finally, Miles sighed and looked away. I'm sorry, he said. I didn't mean that. Ellie's shoulders slumped. Maybe you did, and maybe you're right. The storm passed, but the damage lingered. They began avoiding each other, their once easy rapport replaced by a strained silence. It wasn't until Ellie found herself alone on the bridge late one night, staring at the unfinished structure, that she realized how much she missed him. The turning point came when Miles found a box of old photographs in the lighthouse. They were images of the bridge from decades ago, taken during its original construction. Inspired, he framed one of the photos and left it on Ellie's doorstep with a note. Some things are worth rebuilding. The gesture moved Ellie more than she expected. She sought him out the next day, finding him at the lighthouse. Without a word, she handed him a photograph she'd taken of him, standing on the bridge, his face thoughtful, the wind catching his hair. You look like someone worth believing in, she said. Miles stared at the image, his throat tight. I don't know if I am. You do, Ellie replied. And I think it's time we stop running. Their bond deepened in the days that followed. They began working side by side with renewed purpose, their shared determination breathing life into the project. The bridge, once a symbol of division, became a testament to their growing connection. Together, they found strength in vulnerability. Ellie let Miles into her world, allowing him to see the cracks in her armor. Miles, in turn, opened up about his fears, sharing stories of his past and his hopes for the future. One evening, as they stood on the bridge, the sun dipping below the horizon, Miles reached for Ellie's hand. I'm not perfect, he said, but I want to try. With you. Ellie's heart swelled. Then let's build something together. The bridge wasn't just a restoration project anymore. It was a metaphor for their journey. Each plank, each nail, was a step toward healing. And as they worked together, their love grew stronger, ready to withstand whatever storms lay ahead. The bridge project was nearly complete. The wooden planks had been replaced, the supports reinforced, and the delicate arches repainted to their original beauty. The whole town was abuzz with excitement, anticipating the ribbon-cutting ceremony that would mark the bridge's reopening. But beneath the surface, Ellie and Miles' relationship was on the brink of collapse. The storm. It began with an argument. One that started small but quickly spiraled into something neither of them could control. The storm outside was fierce, the wind howling through the town like an angry spirit. Ellie had arrived at the bridge site late, drenched from the rain, to find Miles inspecting the newly laid planks. She was late because of an email from a prestigious photography magazine, offering her a 6-month assignment overseas. A dream job she wasn't sure she wanted anymore. "You could have told me," Miles said, his voice tight with frustration. He had overheard the workers talking about Ellie's potential departure. "I was going to," Ellie replied, her tone defensive. "But I needed time to think." "Time to think? This isn't just about you, Ellie. He stopped himself, running a hand through his rain-soaked hair. "I thought we were building something here. Together." Ellie bristled, the tension she'd been holding inside snapping like a rubber band. "And what about you, Miles? You act like you're all in, but you keep me at arm's length. Every time I try to get closer, you shut down." Miles' jaw tightened, his brown eyes flashing with pain. "Maybe that's because every time I let someone in, they leave." Ellie froze, the raw emotion in his voice hitting her like a wave. She wanted to reach out, to tell him she wasn't going anywhere. But the fear of staying, of giving up her independence, and getting hurt held her back. The rain grew heavier, pounding against the bridge as they stood there in silence, the weight of their unspoken fears hanging between them. Finally, Miles shook his head and turned away. "Maybe it's better if we finish the project and move on," he said quietly, his voice hollow. Ellie's heart twisted, but she didn't stop him as he walked away. She watched his figure disappear into the storm, the sound of his footsteps fading until there was nothing left but the rain. The breaking point. For days, Ellie and Miles avoided each other. The bridge, once a symbol of their connection, became a battleground of silence and unresolved emotions. Ellie threw herself into her photography, capturing the final stages of the restoration. Miles buried himself in the technical aspects of the project, refusing to let his emotions interfere with his work. But the distance between them was unbearable. Ellie found herself standing in the darkroom late one night, staring at a photograph she'd taken of Miles weeks earlier. He was leaning against the bridge's railing, the sunlight catching the lines of his face. There was something about the photo, something vulnerable and hopeful, that brought tears to her eyes. She realized then that she didn't want to run anymore, but she wasn't sure if it was too late. The next day, disaster struck. The storm that had lingered off the coast for days finally unleashed its fury. Heavy rains caused the river below the bridge to swell, the waters rising dangerously high. The pressure against the newly reinforced supports was immense, and cracks began to form in the structure. Miles was the first to notice. He was at the lighthouse, reviewing the final inspection plans, when he heard the frantic shouts of workers running toward the bridge. Without hesitation, he grabbed his jacket and rushed to the site. Ellie was already there, her camera forgotten as she stood near the edge of the bridge, watching in horror as the water threatened to tear it apart. She felt a hand on her shoulder and turned to see Miles, his face grim. "We need to stabilize the supports," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. "If we don't, the whole thing could collapse." Ellie nodded, following him as he barked orders to the workers. The two of them worked side by side in the pouring rain, hauling sandbags and reinforcing beams. The water was icy, soaking through their clothes and numbing their fingers, but neither of them stopped. At one point, Ellie slipped on the wet planks, nearly falling into the raging river below. Miles was there in an instant, grabbing her arm and pulling her back. "Be careful," he shouted, his voice laced with fear. "I can't lose you." Ellie looked up at him, her heart pounding. "You won't," she said, gripping his hand tightly. "Not if I can help it." The test. As the storm raged on, it became clear that their efforts might not be enough. One of the workers shouted from the far end of the bridge, "The south beam's giving out." Miles cursed under his breath, glancing at Ellie. "I'll go." "No, you won't," Ellie said firmly. "You're not doing this alone." "Ellie, don't argue with me, Harrington," she said, cutting him off. "We're in this together." Miles didn't have time to protest. The two of them made their way to the south beam, the wind nearly knocking them off balance. The beam was badly damaged, the wood splintering under the pressure of the water. Miles quickly assessed the situation, his mind racing. "We need to secure it with the spare metal braces in the truck," he said. "It's the only way." As they worked, the beam groaned ominously, threatening to give way at any moment. Ellie's hands trembled as she tightened the bolts, her breath coming in short gasps. Miles placed a hand on hers, steadying her. "Breathe," he said softly, his voice cutting through the chaos. "We can do this." Ellie nodded, her fear melting away under his steady gaze. They worked in sync, each movement precise and purposeful. Finally, the last brace was secured, and the beam held firm. They stood there for a moment, their breaths mingling in the cold air, before a shout from one of the workers drew their attention. The waters receding, relief washed over them as they realized their efforts had paid off. The bridge was safe for now. The revelation. As the storm began to die down, Miles and Ellie found themselves alone on the bridge. The workers had gone to assess the rest of the damage, leaving the two of them standing in the rain, exhausted but victorious. Miles turned to Ellie, his eyes searching hers. "You didn't have to stay," he said. "You could have walked away." Ellie took a step closer, her voice trembling with emotion. "I didn't want to. I was scared, Miles. Scared of losing myself, of getting hurt. But then I realized something." "What?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "That you're worth the risk," she said, tears streaming down her face. It's worth fighting for." Miles reached out, brushing a strand of wet hair from her face. "I've spent so long trying to rebuild my life. I didn't realize I needed you to help me do it." Ellie smiled through her tears, her heart swelling with love. "So, what do we do now?" "We keep building," Miles said, pulling her into his arms. Together, they stood there, holding each other as the rain finally stopped and the first rays of sunlight broke through the clouds. The bridge, battered but standing strong, was a testament to their resilience, a symbol of the love they had fought so hard to protect. The morning after the storm, Willow's Edge awakened to a golden sunrise that kissed the battered bridge and the soaked streets with warmth and light. The storm had tested the town's resilience, but it had endured. So had Ellie and Miles. Ellie sat on the edge of the bridge, her camera in hand, the strap looped securely around her neck. She wasn't taking pictures. Instead, she stared at the river below, reflecting on the chaotic night and the flood of emotions that followed. The bridge, though bruised by the storm, stood strong, a testament to the love and labor poured into it. And like the bridge, Ellie knew that her relationship with Miles had survived a trial that could have easily torn them apart. "Mind if I join you?" Miles' voice came from behind her, calm but tentative. She turned to see him standing there, a faint smile on his face. He looked different, lighter somehow. The storm had stripped away his walls, leaving behind a man ready to face what came next. Ellie patted the space beside her, and Miles sat down, their shoulders brushing. "I owe you an apology," he began, "for pushing you away when things got hard. I thought I was protecting myself, but all I did was hurt you." Ellie shook her head, her heart aching at his vulnerability. "You're not the only one who's been scared, Miles. I've spent so long running from anything that felt permanent, convincing myself I was better off alone. But last night, I realized something." Miles looked at her, his brown eyes soft with curiosity. "What's that?" She smiled a little shyly. "That permanence isn't something to fear. It's something to build, and I want to build it with you." For a moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of her words settling between them. Then Miles reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, battered notebook. He flipped it open to a page filled with sketches of the bridge. But in the corner, Ellie saw something else, a series of small doodles of a lighthouse and a bridge intertwined. "I've been thinking about this for a while," Miles said, his voice steady but emotional. "This bridge isn't just about the town. It's about us. Every plank, every nail, it's a piece of what we've been building together." Ellie's eyes filled with tears. "It's beautiful, Miles." He reached out, his hand brushing hers. "So are you." In that moment, Ellie leaned into him, her head resting on his shoulder as they watched the river flow beneath the bridge. The tension of the storm was gone, replaced by a quiet sense of peace and certainty. They had faced the worst, and they had come out stronger. Supporting characters' reactions. The bridge's reopening ceremony a week later was a celebration of resilience and community. The townspeople gathered at the site, their voices a chorus of excitement and gratitude. Banners fluttered in the breeze, and children ran along the riverbank, their laughter echoing through the air. Ellie and Miles stood together near the ribbon, their fingers intertwined. Lily, ever the observant friend, sidled up to Ellie with a knowing grin. "Well, look at you," Lily teased. "You're glowing and holding hands. Who are you, and what have you done with my commitment-phobic best friend?" Ellie laughed, nudging Lily playfully. "Let's just say I finally found something worth staying for." Lily's expression softened, and she hugged Ellie tightly. "I'm happy for you. You deserve this." Meanwhile, Miles' brother, Daniel, approached him with a rare smile. "I have to admit, I wasn't sure about this whole move to a small town and fix a bridge plan of yours. But I've never seen you like this. You seem happy." "I am," Miles replied, glancing at Ellie. For the first time in a long time, when the mayor cut the ribbon, the crowd erupted in cheers, and Miles and Ellie exchanged a look filled with pride and love. The bridge stood as a symbol of everything they had fought for, not just for the town, but for themselves. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Ellie and Miles found themselves back at the lighthouse. The storm-damaged structure had been repaired, its light once again casting a beacon over the darkening waters. It was a fitting place to mark a new chapter in their lives. Ellie brought her camera, but this time it wasn't to hide behind it. She handed it to Miles with a playful smile. "Your turn," she said. "Take a picture of us." Miles chuckled, adjusting the camera awkwardly. "I still don't know what I'm doing." "Just point and shoot," Ellie instructed, pulling him close. "And don't forget to smile." The camera clicked, capturing their laughter and the glow of the lighthouse behind them. When Miles looked at the image, his breath caught. It wasn't just a picture. It was a moment frozen in time, one that captured the essence of everything they had built together. Ellie took his hand, her eyes sparkling. "What do you think?" "I think it's perfect," Miles said, his voice thick with emotion. "And so are we." The moral of their story was clear. Love, like a bridge, isn't built overnight. It takes time, patience, and the courage to weather storms together. Ellie and Miles had learned to embrace the imperfections, knowing that the cracks and scars only made their connection stronger. As they stood there, the lighthouse's beams sweeping across the dark waters, Ellie felt something she hadn't felt in years: hope. Not just for the future, but for the here and now. "Thank you for staying," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the waves. Miles tightened his hold on her hand. "Thank you for letting me in." The two of them stood in silence, watching the lighthouse and the bridge they had saved. It wasn't just the structures that had been restored. It was their hearts, their hope, and their belief in second chances. As the light from the lighthouse stretched out over the water, Ellie and Miles walked back toward the town, hand in hand, ready to face whatever came next. Together,